You are listening to I Am Refocused Radio with your host, Shamaya Reed. This show is designed to inspire you to live your purpose and regain your focus. And now, here's your host, Shamaya Reed.
Hey, welcome to I Am Refocused Radio, man. We are here once again today. We have another special interview for y'all. Today, we're going to talk to a retired NYPD detective turned author. And man, not only does he has amazing books, there's some comedy in there as well. So we're going to have some good laughs today as well. We're going to talk to Vic Ferrari. He's an awesome guy. First and foremost, man, I want to say thank you for your service to what you did for being a detective. And welcome to the show, man.
Thank you so much for having me on your show. I appreciate it.
So, man, take us back being an NYPD detective. What inspired you to take that path for that career?
When I was a little boy, growing up in the Bronx, my mom used to take me to the movie theater. And around the corner from the movie theater was a police station. So when my brother and I, my mother's walking us hand in hand as little kids, I would run up to the police cars and stare inside and look at the equipment. And sometimes the cops would let me sit in the police car and play with the sirens. So I knew what I wanted to do by like the age of 5. And then I like to tell a story by 10. My friends and I used to sneak into the post office and steal FBI wanted posters off the walls and go around the neighborhood and have manhunts. So at an early age, I knew I wanted to be a cop. I knew I wanted to be a detective later on. And I was lucky enough at 20, I went into the police academy and got the ball rolling.
Now, that is interesting. You got to tell me more about that story of taking you said FBI most wanted posters?
Yeah. So back in the day, the post office, they had wanted posters all over the place. So we would walk in. We were 10 years old. We had no business being in the post office. We didn't even know how the post office worked. But we saw those wanted posters, and it's like, oh, look at this. This guy's wanted for a bank robbery in Kentucky. Maybe he made his way over to the Bronx. So we'd pull a couple off the wall, and then we'd start walking around the neighborhood. We'd go into like a deli, and there'd be some poor telephone company repairman getting his sandwich, and we'd be looking at the photograph and then looking at him and going, this could be the guy right here. He could have been the guy. So, it just was like a boyhood cops and robbers things that we used to do.
And that's awesome, man. And when you were getting older, did you have a mentor or somebody who kind of took you underneath their wings for showing the ropes of one day having that career? I mean, did someone kind of introduce you to the opportunity?
Not really, because my dad was a butcher. I had no family in the police department. So I was lucky enough. I worked in a gas station, and the cops would come in from time to time to get repairs done on their cars or snow chains put on the tires when it snowed. So I would just pick their brain. And it was just like a conglomeration of probably 30 or 40 people that I just would ask 1,000,001 questions, because as a kid, I believed, the things that happen with the police is what I watched on television. And, they would know you can't do that. And it's not like this and blah, blah, blah. So I really didn't have a mentor per se until I got into the police department. And then there were a couple of people that were instrumental in getting my career on track.
Now, when you started on day one, what was that job experience like? Was it everything you expected, or was it totally surprising? What was like as far as starting out?
Well, there were 2 day ones. So there was day one in the police academy, which I said, what the hell is this? Like, I thought the police academy was going to be one way. And, I went, I just about got out of high school, by the skin of my neck. And now here I am in another classroom setting. And I was like, I don't know if I can hang. I don't know if I can do this for 6 months. But I put my nose to the grindstone. I got through it. But my first day, which was bizarre, was in field training. So back in the day, they would drop you off on foot in the middle of nowhere. And basically, it was baptism by fire to figure things out. And I remember, I grew up in the Bronx. They dropped me off in the South Bronx on a foot post, and people are coming up to me, speaking to me in Spanish, and I barely knew Spanish. And people are coming to you with their problems. And, the police academy is only 6 months, and they can't really get to everything. So it was a lot of getting on the radio and calling for the sergeant to show up, and then he would instruct you what to do. But I got hired in like the middle of the crack epidemic in the early 80s. So, that was another side of humanity that I wasn't expecting. Crackheads walking up to you with stuff they stole and living in abandoned buildings. And I just remember saying to myself, this is totally not what I expected.
Man, I mean, that's so interesting, and I can't help but think that you had some comedy in your career as well with those different stories. When you were interacting with people of the city, I mean, were you able to kind of easily distinguish, okay, this person is a normal person, or okay, or this person, they kind of look like they're up to no good? What was it like just interacting with people in the city?
Oh, it takes a while. It definitely takes a while to know who's being straight up front with you and who's pulling your leg. And I mean, again, I grew up in the city, so I think I had a leg up on a lot of the kids that got hired from upstate New York and Long Island because I grew up in the Bronx. But people would come up to you. There was a guy that used to come into the precinct all the time, and the guy dressed in a suit and tie, wore an overcoat, and he carried a briefcase, and he looked like an attorney. And he would come up to you, and he was what we call an EDP, an emotionally disturbed person, but you didn't know it if you're a rookie cop. And he would come up to you and serve you with papers. And the next thing you know, your name would appear in these briefs, and he would accuse you of killing his wife. And when you're a rookie cop, no one tells you this. And he would come into the station house, and the old timers would laugh their asses off because you're indulging this person. You think you're trying to help them. And, he was crazy. And he would come in, and then finally they'd say, all right, that's enough. The guy's name was Bernard. They're like, all right, Bernard, you can go now. Or we had a guy who thought he was Hector Macho Camacho. He was a little Spanish guy who would shadowbox you in front of the precinct parking lot. So there was always a cast of characters. Every NYPD precinct has that, where you have some of these people that they're not quite right, and they have no place, their loved ones don't have the time to watch them, and they'll hang around the precinct, and they almost become like mascots. The cops look out for them, and as long as they don't cause too much trouble or, get into trouble, they're allowed to hang around the station house.
And that's awesome. Once again, listen to I'm Focus Radio, talking to our guest today, Vic Ferrari. He is a retired NYPD detective. And man, speaking of the funny moments, are there times, because I know it's a lot of serious situations with that career, but were there times that other officers would just kind of lighten the mood a little bit and kind of, I don't know, make practical jokes or just kind of help everybody get throughout the day?
Yeah, for my book, NYPD Through the Looking Glass, is a whole chapter on practical jokers. And I like to tell the story. I was a detective. I was getting out of work about 6 o'clock. And one of my coworkers realized that I had changed my pants. So when I went up to get a cup of coffee, he soaked my chair with ice water, and I sat in it. My butt got wet. Everybody was laughing. I went upstairs. I changed my pants. I went downstairs. Across the street from the police station was a pet store. I bought 100 crickets in a plastic bag. I went into the parking lot with a Slim Jim, and I opened up his car door to his personal vehicle. I cut open the bag of crickets, and I dumped them in the back seat, and I shut the door. Well, he gets in the car, and he starts driving home. He slams on the brakes, and he's jumping out of the car, and these things are flying around him. He wound up having a roach bomb the car a couple of times, but they kept breeding, so eventually he had to sell the car. I mean, the practical jokes went on all the time. I remember we'd watch two other cops go into the station house for their meal hour. And then while they were inside getting something to eat, we would get into their car. We would take the air vents out, and we would pour cornstarch down the air conditioner vents and then place the vents back and put the AC on high. So when they started up the car, it blew either sugar or cornstarch all over them, and they had to change their uniform.
Man, no, that is very creative. I will never forget the cricket story. That I can only imagine what it'd be like. I mean, here in San Antonio with traffic, I'm sure y'all have heavy traffic in New York, and San Antonio don't compare to New York. But speaking of that, when you are traveling throughout the city, I've been to New York only 2 times, and man, traffic is massive. How is it like to navigate throughout the city when you're dealing with that kind of traffic?
Oh, it's brutal, and you're right. Manhattan, New York City's 5 boroughs, and in the 5 boroughs, you have 9 million people. And Manhattan, by far, is the most difficult to navigate, especially like Midtown. You're right. I mean, you can just sit there, and you're not going anywhere. I was lucky enough, most of my career, I worked in the Bronx or upper Manhattan, like Washington Heights, it's still very crowded and a lot of double parked vehicles. But I mean, there were times on emergency calls where we had to drive down the sidewalk, where you had to get inventive, or sometimes even just leave the car in the street. If it was a heavy call and you were a block or two away, just jump out of the car and run.
And kind of touching with your books and your writing leads up to the next question. You have a book where you talk about car theft rings that you busted. Can you tell us a little bit about that and what that experience was like for you?
Yeah, my last 10 years, I was a detective in the NYPD's auto crime division. So anything with chop shops, stolen vehicles, exporting stolen vehicles out of the country, changing vehicle identification numbers on stolen cars for resale, I was involved in. I mean, as far as trying to put an end to it. In the 1990s, New York City averaged over 150,000 stolen vehicles a year. So we definitely had our hands full. I mean, if you started running plates in a car, it was off to the races with a stolen vehicle fairly quickly. In my unit, we did a lot of organized crime, a lot of mafia stuff. And one of the biggest cases we worked on, we had individuals that were shipping 30 stolen Audis a month to Shanghai. And we had Chinese nationals in Brooklyn that had a warehouse. And we had a middleman in the Bronx who used to, the Chinese guys used to pay the middleman $5,000 a vehicle. He would pay the thieves between $500 and $1,000 a car, and they would steal between 25 and 30 Audi A6s a month. They would go in the street and they would cool off to make sure that the vehicles didn't have low jack or a GPS system. From there, they would go into the warehouse and they would put 2 stolen Audis per container. They would let the air out of the tires so the car would sit low. Then they would build a frame above it and drive 2 more cars above it so they could get 3 to 4 stolen vehicles per shipping container. And then the shipping containers would get trucked out to Newark, New Jersey, where they were put on trains. They were railed across the United States to Long Beach, California, where they were put on cargo ships and shipped to Shanghai. And we were on multiple wiretaps, and we quickly figured out that in addition to stealing 30 cars a month, our thieves were in the murder for hire business. So they were talking about whacking this guy and whacking that guy. So when we eventually took that case down, we solved about 15 homicides.
Wow. And speaking of homicides, what was the steps when you arrived at a crime scene? What was the part of your detail for your job? And what was the things that you were responsible of doing?
Sure. So I was a detective, but not in a detective squad. So like when you see on television, Law and Order, there's a bunch of detectives waiting around for something to come in, anything. And an NYPD precinct, they're handling anything from a homicide to a bounce check to domestic violence. I worked in organized crime. So if you ever saw the movie Heat with Robert De Niro and Al Pacino, we just weren't as well dressed. We went after crews, organized gangs. We weren't in homicide per se. And a lot of the homicides we would come across were already in the past. And we would gather information either through informants or, like I mentioned earlier, through a wiretap. So now you're going backward. You're like, okay, this guy killed somebody. He's talking about it. Now we got to figure out who's the victim, where did it happen, and now can we find this homicide, and now can we link this person to it? As a cop, when I was a police officer on patrol, I did walk into many crime scenes. I walked into a couple of homicide scenes, and you try not to touch anything. You wait for the medical examiner to arrive, and they do their forensic investigation. And then the NYPD had what was called a crime scene unit. They were the ones that would take blood swabs, fingerprints. You kind of just stayed out of the way until the experts, you guarded the crime scene and made sure nobody went like traipsing through it.
Once again, this time on Focus Radio, talking to our special guest today, retired NYPD detective Vic Ferrari. And man, when you decided to retire and eventually start writing books, when did you decide, okay, I'm going to start writing? Was that, what was the timeline for that after you retired from NYPD detective?
Yeah, I retired in 2007. I became a police officer down in Florida afterwards. And that didn't work out. It was coming from the world's largest police department as a detective to working in a small police department doing midnights. That's a young man's game, dealing with the domestic, the drunk. So I re-retired. And at the bequest of my friends and family, they said, you got all these wild stories. Why don't you write them down and write a series of books? And I was apprehensive to do it at first, but I said, if I'm going to do it, I don't want to get anybody divorced or embarrassed. So I changed the names, the dates, locations. And I wrote my first book, NYPD Through the Looking Glass, Stories from Inside America's Largest Police Department. And the book started selling, and I was shocked. And the feedback was great. The reviews came in. I says, let me write another one. And I've written a series of 4 books about the New York City Police Department. It's just kind of taken off for me.
Yeah, I was looking at the reviews. I mean, it's a ton of reviews on all of your books. So congrats on that. You had a recent one, NYPD, Law and Order, Tell All NYPD books. Is that kind of touching on stories behind your career, or what is that about?
All my books are short stories about the characters I worked with, interesting criminals, things that went wrong, things that the average person wouldn't think that would happen. Just to give you a quick story, if there's one way to get in trouble in the NYPD, it's to lose your gun, your shield, or your police ID card. If you lose any of those 3 things, they're going to take 30 vacation days from you and put you on a year probation. So needless to say, NYPD cops are paranoid about losing those 3 things. I worked with a guy who wasn't the brightest of guys, and he was going out one night, and he was going to go out and have a couple of drinks. He didn't want to take his gun with him. So he figured he'd hide his gun in the one place he didn't think anyone would look, which was his stove. Well, he goes out, comes home 4 hours, 9 beers later. He's a little liquored up. He's hungry. He's going to make himself some frozen pizzas. So he preheats his oven to 425. He goes in to the living room and starts channel surfing. Well, there's gunpowder and bullets. So what happens is that oven starts heating up, and the rounds in the gun start exploding. So probably the first shot that went off scared the hell out of him. The second one, probably he said, oh, I know what that is. And the poor guy had to crawl out of his apartment on his hands and knees while his stove was shooting at him, and call 911 on himself. And then our emergency service had to come and get into the apartment. And then his gun was destroyed. He needed a new stove. And yes, he lost 30 vacation days, and he got put on a year of probation anyway.
Man, you took friendly fire to a new level.
Yeah.
Man, that's wild. Now, when you see like the next generation of officers, are there times you find yourself talking to the younger ones who just got started in a career? Is there any ties that you still have with NYPD?
Well, not anymore, because I'm retired 15 years, but like towards the end of my career, I worked in the same office for 10 years. So I was the old guy. Even though I was in my early 40s, I was considered the old guys, because you got kids coming in 25, 30 years old. They just got their detective shield, and they're in our office. It was, it's funny. I don't want to sound like an old man, but it was definitely different. The generational differences. I mean, it was the video game generation, that came into law enforcement. So, and it took a while for me to really like reach them as far as mentoring them, because different people have different interests, and it was challenging.
And when you look back at your career, and someone listening to this in New York or just anywhere, United States, and they're considering to go into law enforcement, what's some words of wisdom will you give to that person so that way they can position themselves to have a great career?
When you go, and this goes for any place in law enforcement, not just the NYPD, when you become a cop and you get out of the police academy and you go to whatever police station or whatever municipality, keep your mouth shut and your ears open. There's things going on that you're not going to understand. Just watch, observe. People will come to you sometimes and you think they're okay and they're not okay. And that happens in law enforcement sometimes, where, you get some dirtbag cop that's mentoring a younger cop, and he teaches them all, the shortcuts of doing things right off the bat. And then that kid is kind of ruined. So nobody likes a know-it-all. Nobody likes somebody that, tries to, they're brand new and already they're throwing their weight around, but just keep your mouth shut and your ears open and try to learn as much as you can.
And when you were an officer, did you have the opportunity to meet very influential people, aka famous people? And if so, were some of the famous people experience that you were able to have as an officer?
Yeah, in my book, The NYPD's Flying Circus, there's a chapter called Rubbing Elbows, where, I mean, if you're a cop in New York, and it doesn't matter what borough, you're going to meet famous people. You just are. And goodness, I met Julianne Moore. I met Columbo, Peter Falk, crossing the street. He denied who he was. And my partner and I kind of walked him into a car and I said, I know you're Columbo. And finally he admitted it. Brad Garrett from Everybody Loves Raymond. John Lovitz from Saturday Night Live. International famous people. I met Jesse Jackson. I met Baki Moon, Benjamin Netanyahu. I'm a higher functioning Forrest Gump for my 20-year career that I saw a lot and met a lot of interesting people.
And earlier in the interview, you mentioned about the mafia and all that. Were you ever, it's probably an interesting question, but were you ever nervous or had any concerns dealing with, the mafia and going to certain places in the city?
Well, here's the thing with the mob. Most of them, there was, an unwritten rule. You didn't mess with law enforcement. But were there some of them that if they had the opportunity to hurt you or, take you out, yeah, they do it. So, there were a handful of guys that I think if the opportunity arose and they could hurt a cop, yeah, I think they would. I wouldn't say nervous. It's one of those things where you have a dangerous job and you're aware of it. You know what I mean? It's you try not to dwell on it. You try not to let it impact your performance. But at the same time, it's the same as if you were a lion tamer. That lion can turn on you at any minute. You know what I mean? If you fall down or, the lion's in a bad mood and you make the wrong move, you could lose your arm or worse. So it's kind of the same thing, if you know what I mean.
We're talking to our special guest today, retired NYPD detective Vic Ferrari. And man, Vic Ferrari, I got to ask you this question because you serve law enforcement in New York. Were you around, where were you, I should ask, better question, when 9/11 happened? And how did you feel when the series of events were going on throughout that day and eventually being able to experience going to ground zero?
Yeah, I was up in my office in the Bronx. I was supposed to be in Manhattan criminal court that morning at 9:00 in the morning. I locked some guy up for a couple of stolen cars. He was going to flip and become an informant. So I was supposed to go down that morning with my sergeant and do a deal with the district attorney's office and his defense attorney. And my sergeant was late. And when the first plane hit, a cop ran into our office, said, "Put on the news, plane hit the World Trade Center." And we were watching it. The second plane hit, and we said, okay, we know it's terrorism. Call came from downtown. Everybody stand by, get into uniform. And by 1:30, I was down there walking around. And it was like something out of a science fiction movie. You just couldn't believe it was happening. I mean, there was just dust and debris flying all over the place. The closer you got to ground zero, the darker it was because of all that volcanic ash that got blown into the air. The sunlight had difficulty getting through the particles. I remember, I think we were walking down Broadway, seeing thousands of pairs of women's shoes. So you had all these women that worked in the financial district, Wall Street and the World Trade Center. When they were fleeing, they couldn't run in heels, so they just threw their shoes. So you're walking down, everything's covered in this ash, and you see women's high heel shoes all over the place. And when we got up to ground zero, it was like that scene, the last scene of Planet of the Apes, when Charlton Heston is looking at the Statue of Liberty head, on the beach. I'm looking at the facade of the World Trade Center, which must have fallen thousands of feet. It was embedded into the ground. And we're just like, wow, like we just couldn't believe what was going on. It was kind of chaos down there. And I was there from probably about 1:30 in the afternoon till about 5 a.m. And they sent us home and they told us to come back to work at 5. And we were doing like 12 to 14 hour shifts for the first week. And then they pulled my team out of that. And then we returned a week or two later when we were doing the bucket brigade, where you had a line of people going to the top of ground zero, like a pile. We looked like ants on sugar. And we would pass like a 5-gallon joint compound bucket filled with debris, and it would go down the line, and then it would get sorted. And then later, when they started bringing in the heavy equipment to get all the debris out of there, they sent my team to Staten Island. They had reopened an abandoned dump, and they were bringing the vehicles out there. And they had us, using things that, like, the fire department has the jaws of life to cut open a lot of these crushed vehicles to make sure no one had been trapped in there.
Wow. Man. Once again, listen, I'm Focus Radio, talking to retired NYPD detective Vic Ferrari. And man, once again, I want to say thank you for what you have done serving in law enforcement. And when you look at the country, not to be political, but when you look at the country and you see how people are not understanding law enforcement personnel, what would you say to people to help them better understand what y'all go through and what y'all are trying to do for your city?
I think it cuts both ways. I think law enforcement has made tremendous steps from, like, when I first started in the early 80s to reaching out to the community and forging alliances with the community, because the cops are only as good as the community that's feeding them the information. It's one thing to respond to a call. Someone calls 911, the cops show up. Great. And then the cops try to mediate the problem the best way they can. But it's also good when you have people come forward that call the police or stop by the station house or during community meetings where someone says, listen, I live in this building and I know on the 3rd floor there's 2 jokers up there selling drugs and people are coming and going all hours of the night. So the police are really only as good as the community reaching out to them with information. So it definitely goes both ways.
And it's an honor having you on the show today, talking about your career. And also, man, you can get his amazing books on Amazon. All you got to do really is type Vic Ferrari and you see all his amazing books there. And before we let you go, I want to say happy holidays. It's almost Christmas time. And 2, what call to action would you want our listeners to take outside of getting your books?
Yeah, outside of going to Amazon and buying my books, if they want to get a hold of me, on Twitter and Instagram at Vic Ferrari 50.
Awesome, man. Once again, listen to Army Focus Radio, talking to retired NYPD detective Vic Ferrari. You can get all his amazing books. Just go to Amazon and type Vic Ferrari. You see all the amazing different books that he's written. I want to say thank you again, sir, taking time in your schedule, talking to Army Focus Radio.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.